United States of America, and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. I love hearing that part, liberty and justice for all. It's just my favorite part of that. So we're on lecture 4, and it's from 1776 to 1789, from independence to the Constitution. So we're going from the Declaration of Independence and jumping into the Constitution somewhat. And did everyone get a chance to read Bastiat this week? It's interesting in the at page 239, if you want to turn to that part, the question before us, the question of legal plunder has to be settled once and for all, and there are only 3 ways to settle it, right? The first is the few plunder the many. Doesn't sound very pleasant, does it? Everybody plunders everybody. That's basically anarchy. And nobody plunders anybody. Kind of like that, the sound of that last one. How about you? So we've got to make a choice among limited plunder, universal plunder, and no plunder. The law can only follow one of these, right? So let's talk about limited legal plunder. This system prevailed when the right to vote was restricted. You could turn back to this system to prevent socialism, and it's still not a perfect situation. So then you can go to the universal legal plunder. And I think right now there's a lot of plunder going on with the government, and we're all just kind of watching it happen and saying, what do I do? What can we do? How do we change this? So, and one of the things Bastiat talked about was the enfranchise. That's voters. So initially, it was heads of household that did the voting. So you voted for your family, which made some sense. Usually the head of the household, because women were the last ones to get the right to vote. And so now we have people coming right out of high school, basically, and being able to vote. They haven't been out in the world. They haven't learned to make a living. They don't understand how the private sector pays for everything that the public sector is doing. They don't understand any of that. And then you're electing people. And what have the elected people learned to do? Right. And they offer all kinds of things. They get in and they say, oh, yeah, free this, free that. And young people, of course, go, oh, mom and dad aren't paying anymore. Yeah, I go for that. And so it's kind of tricking people into voting their way. So the majority has decided to formulate law on the same principle as legal plunder that was used by their predecessors when the vote was limited. I'm not sure if that makes a lot of sense to you. Is it making sense? Okay. So no legal plunder. That's the perfect situation. And that involves that liberty and justice for all. Peace, order, stability, harmony, and logic. Until the day of my death, Bastiat says, I shall proclaim this principle with all the force of my lungs, which, alas, is all too inadequate. Isn't that interesting? This is back in the 1800s. So about 1850. So here we are. It applies today. We're trying to get back to that. And the trickery that's come into it as far as voting is, right, we're dealing with all kinds of attempted control over the voting and what the people that intend justice is to get the vote so that we're sure that when we voted, it's counted. And when someone that is not allowed to vote votes, it's not counted. So that's sort of the most recent messing or using legal plunder is our actual voting systems. I mean, we can say, get out there and vote all you want, but there's this battle between, no, they cheated. No, they didn't. Yes, they did. No, they didn't. So anyway, and in a moment, I want to watch a short video, but if you can pull out your jurisdictional boundaries, it was email 4.1, then we'll get into that right after this little video.
Let's talk for just a minute about jurisdiction. The Latin word juris means law, and dicto means I speak. So if a person or an institution has jurisdiction over a matter, this means that the person or the institution has the authority to speak or to say what the law is regarding this matter. Now please notice that this does not mean that having jurisdiction over a matter gives one the authority to make the law, just to speak it, to declare it, and to enforce it. Now, in the American view of law and government, we recognize that the law of nature and of nature's God is a fixed, unchanging standard. And jurisdiction, the authority to speak and to enforce the law, is given by God to 4 separate governments. We can visualize this delegation of God's authority by thinking of the 4 walls of a room, each wall representing one of the 4 governments, the spheres of authority that God has authorized in His Word. First, there is self-government, in which we as individuals are required to control ourselves, to conform our behavior to the strictures of God's commandments. For example, the commandments require that we positively discharge certain duties like worshiping the one true God and honoring our mothers and fathers. The commandments also compel us not to do certain things such as steal or bear false witness. The commandments address us personally and apply to us personally. Now, the remaining 3 jurisdictions are institutional in nature. They include the family, ordained by God in the Garden of Eden, and charged with providing for the health, education, and welfare of its members. God designed and declared that the family is the primary institution of human society with the widest range of duties and responsibilities. Next, we have the church, whose head is Jesus Christ, and which is charged by Christ with the promulgation of His gospel, the training of all church members in disciple-making, and the distribution of the sacraments. Lastly, we have the civil government, which is charged by God with defending the borders and administering the justice system so that the Lord's people might live in peace and harmony. Overarching all these jurisdictions and their authorities is God's jurisdiction and authority, which by nature of His status as creator of all is all-encompassing and universal. Since He is the creator and the designer of each of the earthly jurisdictions, His authority flows from Him down and through each earthly jurisdiction. In this way, we can see that while there is, in fact, a separation between the duties of the church and the duties of the state, there is no separation of God and His law from civil government. To the contrary, there is an absolute duty on the part of the civil government to understand, to promote, and to enforce the law of the Creator. Our founders, in the Declaration of Independence, referred to God as the supreme judge of the universe, because His jurisdiction supersedes every act of civil government. So, if someone tries to tell you that God and His law don't have anything to do with civil government, then you can be sure that this person does not understand American history or American government. And he or she should not get your vote or your support. This is Michael Anthony Peruka for Institute on the Constitution, bringing you the American view.
Dum, dum. So did you pull out your jurisdictional boundaries email? Kind of going to go through that real quick, which is what this was talking about, right? Did you ever think about it that way? All these various boundaries and who had the authority? In fact, civil government has the least amount of authority under our way of government. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah, Cheryl had it depicted here. Can barely see it. It's just a little triangle at the top. Yeah. So, so government definitions, we have that up on the the screen. They direct, regulate, control, restraint. It's a lot of very negative terms because what government is, and most of the things, is force. There are 4 distinct jurisdictions. You just saw them. Each has its own limits. Of course, self-government. That's the most crucial of all, right? Children learn from their parents, of course, what self-government's all about. It's like a spoil the rod, spare the rod, spoil the child. You need that rod, right? Because children will turn into little monsters, and then once they grow up, they have to go out in public, and we all have to deal with them. And then we've got all kinds of monsters coming from every direction. And that's the aspect of the second. So they learn to be self-governed by the family government, the parent and child, and those are, I think, pretty self-evident. But what's within the family government? And how about marriage? Raising children, right? And property ownership. Typically, when people get married, eventually they want to buy a home that they can live in, and they need a car. They have to have a business. These are all scriptural. And then there's, of course, inheritance that goes from family member to family member as the elders pass on. Education. It used to be the parents were the only ones that educated their children, and it's kind of returning to that, isn't it? As the public education system seems to be breaking down. And then welfare. And it's up to the family to take care of themselves. And it's only rare that they can't do that. And a lot of times it's people become elder, they don't have any family. So then the third jurisdiction is the church government. The persons or council who direct the ministries and ordinances of the church. So there's the public ministry of the word, which we hear on Sunday, and with some of the podcasts we have going on these days, we hear it other times. The ministry of the ordinances of communion, baptism, those sorts of things. And and the ministry to help those who cannot help themselves. And the civil government. So that's the fourth. That's the smallest jurisdiction of government that provide the fundamental rules. There are some rules, like, now that we're not horse and buggy all the time, but I think they even had it back in those days. We've got vehicles, so we do need laws that control people. Otherwise, people are going 100 miles an hour, and there's no traffic instructions and things like that. So we need those, correct? I don't know. There's some other things that you can imagine that we definitely need government for. Anybody have any thoughts on that? So what are you going to add? Yeah, government really helps with like the legal system, the criminal law system. And then we have the civil system when there's disputes between individuals. So it's the rights and duties of citizens. Where do our rights come from? They come from God. And that's the Declaration of Independence enshrined that, right? I think there was discussion about the Declaration of Independence is law in the United States. It's the organic law of the United States of America. So it's still applicable today as it was when written. And within the civil government, you have the Ministry of Justice and military defense. That's another one, right? It just makes sense. So and then within the government itself, there's several levels. We have the federal, the state, and local. Local would be your cities and counties. They both have their own governments and distinct jurisdictions. There's constitutional limits on each one of those, on what they can regulate. there are specific things that we have delegated to the United States government that the states can no longer, they have supremacy. Does that make sense? And we'll get into some of those. That's Article 1, Section 8. We delegated certain things to the federal government. The states no longer have control over that based on the U.S. Constitution. Within the U.S. Constitution, there's other things that say the states cannot, and it's the same things. The states cannot have any control, and that's the supremacy. Is that Section 9, Article 1, Section 9?
We have to remember, too, that delegate, what is that? We've turned it over to them, but what can we do if they're doing it badly?
And that's where we get into the 10th Amendment as well, which states that the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, which was the people, nor prohibited to it by the states, in other words, the states didn't prohibit the federal government, are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. Shoot. I'm sorry, I'm kind of ahead, losing my, just a little bit of imperfection again. You know, we've been doing with this tech stuff, so we didn't have it quite right tonight, so it threw me off a little bit. So just because something is a good idea does not mean the government should do it. And, you know, over time, especially working in the law, I've found, and as an attorney, it's interesting. One example I like to give is some people called me because they were having a dispute with their neighbor over their property line. And this was many years ago. And they called me and wanted me to write this nasty letter to the neighbor. And I asked, have you talked to them? And they went, no. And I went, wow. We want someone else to deal with our problems. It's kind of a headache. You know, it's like when you have a problem with someone, it's like, would you go talk to them? I don't want to talk to them. And that's what we've done with the government. I don't want to deal with these things. It's a headache. They're offering to do it. So, and that's what we've done over time. You know, our predecessors, we've handed things over and we continue to like to do that. Or you run out and find a lawyer and it's like, will you work for nothing to deal with my problems? I get that kind of too, you know. And so it's kind of interesting. And just along those lines, it's very interesting to me right now. We have to report to the state bar certain things once a year. And they keep adding on all these things. And they've always expected attorneys in California to do what's called pro bono work, to do some work for free. So we do it. This is the first year now they're requiring we report how many hours. But it's also very interesting because I went, this is offensive to me and this is socialism. You know, you're watching everything. And then I thought, do government attorneys have to report? No. So the law says, no, they don't have to report any pro bono hours, just those of us in the private sector. And I went, how interesting. And, you know, there's just all of these requirements that keep being added on. It's just kind of, oh, yeah, I can't do it. And then you get to the end of the year and you always have to report all this stuff for the beginning of the year. And it's like, oh my gosh, you have to spend hours doing that, as well as pay the fees and those kinds of things. So it's just, this whole thing is, as a matter of fact, most good ideas are not within the jurisdiction of the government, is really where we're at on this. Yeah. Yeah, seatbelt laws. Sometimes I just want to leave it off just because I feel like I'm rebelling, and then I think, I hope I don't get hit and slam my head into it. But I leave that up to God, you know. I say my prayers and go, you know, my time will be my time, I guess, and I try to be respectful when I drive and that sort of thing, right? Isn't that what we all do? So, Yeah, you can die with your seatbelt, and you can be hurt seriously by the seatbelt. So we always have to ask, who has God ordained authority in any given situation? Not who can do it, but who is supposed to do it. And remember, that's that power and authority that we went through in an earlier lecture. It's like, there are people out there that like being in control and like being the bullies, but those aren't your most pleasant people to be around. And so going through these jurisdictional boundaries again, I just want to ask you a few questions. Under whose jurisdiction does your child's education fall? The parents, family? The family jurisdiction? Okay. And now we have this, and there's all this stuff forcing people into the public system. So education is the responsibility of the parents, not the state. How about, and parents, of course, parents can delegate the responsibility if they choose, and a lot of people would choose that no matter what. I think it's a problem, right? Because parents would rather work and make a boatload of money or whatever it is rather than take it in their own hands as our forefathers did to make sure that our children are getting a good education. But it doesn't alter the jurisdictional boundary even if parents make that choice, right? How about a retirement plan or caring for elderly parents? Whose jurisdiction is that? Family. Yeah, the family. I mean, it could be elderly parents. It could be maybe the husband's doing fine. He's taking care of his wife, but at a certain point, either she passes or whatever, and then he starts failing, and it always stays in the family. Um, and if there are what? Right. So yeah, so that was good. Nowadays, people call and then the government shows up for a wellness check, and then you have all kinds of issues, the government stepping in where it's a family's jurisdiction. So what's the term we've used for that? When one group overtakes the authority that another group has. Perfect, usurpation. Wow, I'm impressed. That's what it is. They're usurping the authority. And this is where the government's usurping the authority of the family jurisdiction and telling people how to raise their children. And, and there's a place for government in that, right? If children are literally being abused, I mean, they're going to school bruised and, or broken arms, things like that, then the government may have to step in. But still, where would you think that would go, depending on the circumstances? Where that might also go first before civil government, the church. But it's never the federal government. And we've had an abortion and all these different things where the federal government was stepping in through the U.S. Supreme Court, right? Did the U.S. Supreme Court have authority? No. And only to interpret under the Constitution. So in the Constitution, the federal government, does it have any jurisdiction over families? No. That's Article 6. What was that? Article 1, Section 8. Cheryl? Yeah. Yeah, the U.S. Supreme Court can't make law, and that's what they did in Roe versus Wade, right? They made it law, and everyone thought this is the law of the land. And finally, the current Supreme Court said, how did they come up with that? That's not what the Constitution said. They didn't even cite the Constitution ever. They just said, this is the way it's going to be. And that's, so this, hmm? They do, but they don't have. They sent it back. They in Roe versus Wade, they told families when they could get abortions, at what point in the gestation cycle, and that was the problem. And the current Supreme Court said how they ever came up with that, I have no idea. There's nothing in the Constitution that says anything about family matters. And there was or health care. That's another one. So speaking of that, what about hospitals and medical care? Whose jurisdiction is that within? It could be itself. You have to take care of your own health and your family, or the church if there's no family. That's traditionally the way it was done in this country, but never the federal government. So name some of the hospitals you've in your area. Most will reflect the truth of the church or family as the original and proper jurisdiction for healthcare. So how about Mercy? How about St. Luke's? I don't know which ones are in this area, your hospitals here. A lot of them have. And it started by churches, and often it was the Catholic Church, and they were the ones that stepped in. So what does this tell us about the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare? That's the unconstitutional. Or how about COVID relief, the stimulus bill? Yeah, we just watched a video last night by Mr. Perutka, and one of the people, there was a Q&A at the end, and the Q&A was back in, do you remember the year, Cheryl? 2012. A gentleman talked about they wanted to force they were laws about the swine flu. It was the swine flu back then, and he said, "What if?" So this video was from 2012. Everyone was probably saying conspiracy theorists, conspiracy, and he said, "What if they someday want to force us to get vaccinations, and they come in our homes and they do this and they do that?" And we were going, wow, that was 2020, 8 years later. So, so another conspiracy theory that proved real. So the really important words I want you to remember is the Constitution is a limited document of enumerated powers. It means powers are written out. They're limited, enumerated, and delegated to the federal government. If it's not written there, it doesn't exist. And the federal government has no jurisdiction. That's something that we've lost. And I keep mentioning Article 1, Section 8, because that's just the one to remember. If in doubt whether the federal government has powers or authority, they can take power, and they've been doing that forever. Okay, we're trying to roll that back, right? And I actually think our president's been dealing with some of that. Like we talked a couple weeks ago with the United Nations, or last week, that was the United Nations, yeah. They're rolling back things that aren't working and should never have been where they are. So Article 1, Section 8 lists all the legitimate categories for where Congress can legislate and where they can spend money. You can try to find health care, education, or Social Security in the Constitution. Telling you aren't going to find it. None of those are there. Or control over families, marriage, abortion, family planning, it isn't there. And so all of these are unconstitutional. So Article 1, Section 8, I know that's in your it's in these little things, but it's also in the back of your, but I don't know what page. Is it 220? It's the Constitution. Just kind of wanted to quickly go over some of these. Page 226, I'm told. Okay. So, what are the first 5 words in section 8? The Congress shall have power to lay and collect taxes. So that's one of theirs. And there's a number of other things there. And how about the clause number 2? Yeah. So they can borrow money. And 3, guys can shout them out if you want. Regulate commerce, right? Uniform rule of naturalization. I'm just going to kind of briefly go over these. 5 is coin money. 6, punishment for counterfeiting and securities of the current coin. And 7 are post offices and post roads. 8, to promote the progress of science and useful arts. Maybe you didn't know that, because it sure seems like money is spent on bad science, as we experienced during COVID. And I'm hoping we're turning that around again. 9, constitute tribunals inferior to the Supreme Court. I don't know if you realize, but there's the U.S. Supreme Court, and then there's that's the highest of the courts in the United States. So in the federal government, there are trial courts. They're called district courts. Every state has a federal district court. Ours for this area is the Northern District, and it's in Sacramento. So whenever you have some dispute where someone here, maybe you're suing someone in the state of Nevada, it can be taken to the U.S. District Court in Sacramento. So that would be a trial court. That's where you go in and you present your evidence. Then there's a decision by the court, and then that can be appealed to the courts of appeal in the federal system, and then finally it would go to the U.S. Supreme Court. And then in California, we have our trial courts, which are in your county. Every county has the Superior Court. If those are appealed, they go to the 3rd District of California, which is a California Court of Appeal. And then if you don't like that decision, you can take it up to the California Supreme Court, and then finally up to the U.S. Supreme Court for the final word in specific cases. So just thought I'd throw that in for you guys that maybe you don't deal in the courts. Hopefully you never have to. And then we've got quite a few other things in here. And if you look at number 17, to exercise of exclusive legislation. So there are some areas where it belongs in the federal courts. And like I just said, if someone in the state of Nevada is suing someone in the state of California, or vice versa, and maybe the person in California sues, and they start in Nevada County or Yuba County. If the defendant lives in another state, they can ask for it to be removed to a federal court. It's when there's 2 jurisdictions involved. And then it talks about for the erection of forts, magazines, arsenals. That's what we talked about before, right? And we will get into, like, number 18, the necessary and proper cause. This one has caused havoc in many ways, is being abused. It's 18, to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers. And that's one of those that has been very abused, and we have quite a bit on that you'll learn later. So, yeah.
Number 1. There's an asterisk. Oh gosh. There's an asterisk, and then it says added for educational purposes. It was not in the original document. So does that have to do with the 16th Amendment?
Oh, oh, uh, oh, if it's in order to add something to the Constitution, there have been amendments to the Constitution. I'm assuming that that was the one that was. Um,
All that is the numbers. See, if you look at your little constitution, I just wrote the numbers in on mine. Um, the numbers aren't there, just the numbers. Yeah.
oh, that's what that means. Okay, thank you. Yeah. So that's what it was, the numbers, and I wrote them in on my pocket one because I carry this around with me. So those are called clauses. Because it's Article 1, Section 8, and then you can say Clause 1, 2, 3, yeah. Okay, and so did anyone have any questions or something they wanted to needed clarified so far? Because we're going to go back into the lecture with Jake McCauley. Oh.
This is just a quick thing. I think it's really important for us to remember with this. So the 4 jurisdictional boundaries that there are: self, family, church, and civil government, right? Who's over top of all of those? God. And every law that's made in America has to conform to God's law, or it's not a law at all. And then if you can picture this, I wrote it on each of the walls in here. There's family, civil, self, and church back here. What would be on top? God. Okay, so where the family wall meets the church wall, there is a distinction so they don't take each other's jobs away. What about the civil back there? There's a wall where it meets the other wall. They are separated, but there's not a separation of church and state in that God has to be over all of it. So any laws, I'm just going to say it one more time, any laws that are made, what do they have to do? Conform to God's laws, not just make something up and then tell people they have to murder their babies or whatever. Okay.
Yeah, thanks, Cheryl. And that's the American view of law and government. That's what we're getting back to, is the American view, rather than the view that comes from other countries that are socialist and communist and everything else. This is the American view. And Americans need to understand that and know their history. Okay. So go ahead, if you would, with the... There they go. I think they're going. There we go.
Inscribed on the Liberty Bell are the following words: proclaim liberty in all the land and to all the inhabitants thereof. And that comes from Leviticus 25. In lecture 1, we examined the American view of law and government and contrasted it to other views. In lecture 2, we talked about the religious beliefs of the founding fathers. In lecture 3, we talked about how those religious beliefs became political theory. Now in lecture 4, we're going to take all of this and drop it into historical context. We're going to talk about the period just before the Declaration of Independence and the period between the Declaration and the Constitution. So with lecture 4, here's Jacob.
Well, this lecture we're going to talk about the historical period that led to independence. And the best way to do that is to talk about the factors that led to our independence. Well, first of all, the colonists believed in their ancient rights as Englishmen. own Pilgrim fathers that came over and created the Mayflower Compact. You can see the rights of Englishmen exemplified there. They did not believe they were doing anything revolutionary. This was a restorative process in their minds. They were seeking to restore the rights that they had as Englishmen and English women. And then there was the abrogation of the colonial charters between the colonists and the king. Of course, Parliament's taxation without representation, which, keep in mind, this was only one of 27 grievances. And the issue wasn't with the amount of the tax. It had to do with the fact they had no representation about how much the tax would be or what it was going to be going forward. The Glorious Revolution in 1688, this overthrew the Stuart kings, and it was done bloodlessly. Up until that point, this may be strange in our day and age, but when governments would be taken over or lines of kings would be replaced, oftentimes there was bloodshed that caused that to happen. We also had the English abrogation of the feudal vassal board system or agreement that we had set up. The king was to protect the colonies. And in 1775, Parliament said that they were no longer going to uphold their part of the contract. They dropped any protection of the colonists. And finally, we had the English rejection of the colonists' petition to the king. The king refused to intercede on the colonists' behalf with Parliament. Now that we've looked at these factors, this then led the colonists to declare their independence. And the best way to understand why they declared independence, I think, is to look at the document itself. So that's what we're going to do. The Declaration was drafted by a congressional committee. In other words, Thomas Jefferson was not the only author or the sole author of this. It was a committee that consisted of Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, Roger Sherman, and Robert Livingston. Most of the duty of writing the document was done by Thomas Jefferson. Congress voted to declare independence on the 2nd of July, 1776, and it was then adopted by Congress on July 4th. Now, Rhode Island had already declared independence on the 4th of May, 1776, so they were a little ahead of the curve. Now, we're going to briefly outline the Declaration of Independence. I'm not going to go through all the wording, but we're going to hit the major points, the key factors. First was the colonies are entitled to independence by the laws of nature and nature's God, borrowing again from Sir William Blackstone. But a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires the colonies to state their reasons. In other words, they wanted everybody to know why they were doing this. I think they also wanted us in the future generations, to understand and give a pattern that we should abide by. Self-evident truths, these are the presuppositions found in the document, that all men are created equal, that all men are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The governments are instituted to secure these rights, and the government derives its just powers from the consent of the governed. A government may be altered or abolished when it violates these principles, and the people should abolish the government only after a long train of abuses and usurpation, not because of transient causes. The Declaration asserts that England engaged in this long train of abuses and usurpations against the colonies. We've talked about a couple factors, but I'd like to dive into the document itself and give the explanation. England refused to assent to necessary colonial laws. They dissolved colonial legislatures. They prevented emigration to the colonies. They made administration of colonial justice impossible by controlling judges and refusing to approve needed laws. They appointed bureaucrats to harass the colonial population, keeping standing armies in the colonies that were not subject to the control of the colonial government, cutting off colonial trade with the rest of the world, taxation without representation, the denial of a trial by jury, transporting colonists for trial in England, and abrogating English common law in Canada, setting the example for the same in the colonies, abolishing colonial charters, taking colonists captive on the high seas, inciting insurrection and Indian warfare against the colonists. The conclusion was that the king was unfit to be a ruler of a free people. He may not be unfit to rule those in England. As far as we were concerned, we were free, and he was unfit to be our ruler. Their efforts to resolve grievances peaceably had gone unheeded, and therefore the declaration was that these united colonies are and of a right ought to be free and independent states. And they bank this on a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence. So now we have a relationship between the Declaration and the Constitution. This relationship consists of this. The best way to understand it is that the Declaration of Independence becomes the why document. Why we are Americans, what makes us American. But there has to be a practical application of what we are going to do now that we are Americans. And that happens to be the how. How are we going to govern ourselves as free men? That's the Constitution. So again, the Declaration is the why document. The Constitution is the how document. And I would like to quote Archie Jones in his book, America's First Covenant, the Christian Principles in the Articles of Confederation. He said the rhetoric of a public document, and especially of a state paper, which is so fundamental as a constitution, is very important, for such rhetoric contains propositions which are basic to the legal and political order, beliefs which enable one to understand the principles and purposes of that order. He continues, these beliefs and teachings are crucial for the individual, society, and the political order. They mean sickness or health, slavery or liberty, death or life. So just where is God in our Constitution? Because we are asserting that our documents are Christian in form and our government is Christian in form. We're asserting that America was founded on the biblical view, the biblical precepts of law and government. Well, you can look to the subscription clause, first of all, where each one of those that signed the document, where our federal government literally embraced in the year of our Lord. They embraced our Lord being Jesus Christ. There was the accepting of Sundays in Article 1, Section 7, honoring the Sabbath. Bills would not be signed. There was also the oath, Article 2, Section 1. When you swear an oath, you don't just swear to those that are in front of you. They only see a fraction of your life or your decisions or your thoughts. God sees everything. So that oath brings on either a blessing or a curse. And that's why it said George Washington put his hand in the Bible. Many believe it was on Deuteronomy 28. The blessings and the curses. If you ruled well, you would be blessed, and so would the nation. If you did not, he would be cursed, and so would the nation. Finally, probably the most convincing proof is the separation of powers. Our founders wrote and spoke extensively. They separated powers because they understood that men populated government institutions and that men were sinful. And they quoted the scripture verse, Jeremiah 17:9, that the heart of man is desperately wicked. Who can know it? Therefore, we must separate man's powers when it comes to civil government. The separation of powers is also found in Isaiah 33:22. For the Lord is our judge, judicial branch. The Lord is our lawgiver, legislative branch. The Lord is our king, the executive branch. It concludes with, He will save us. So is God in the Constitution? Absolutely. You can see it by its evidence. Like you can see if yeast is in bread or not. You can't identify each particle of yeast, but you know that it's there because the bread has risen. Before we had the United States Constitution as it sets now, we had to draft the Articles of Confederation. We were in a hurry. We had just declared independence, and we had no governing document to unite us. Each state created their own independent constitution, and we had what was called the Articles of Confederation. It was drafted by a congressional committee led by John Dickinson in 1776. It was approved in its modified form in the Continental Congress of 77. It was not ratified by all the states until 81. This was more of a compact than a true constitution. A brief outline was that we would be called the United States of America. Discuss the sovereignty of the states, that each state retained its sovereignty, freedom, and independence. Every power, jurisdiction, and right which is not by this confederation expressly delegated to the United States in Congress assembled. The purpose was to be a league of friendship for common defense, security of liberty, and mutual welfare. That citizens in America had rights while in other states. Discuss the structure of Congress, and the states may not make treaties or maintain standing armies except as necessary for defense. The states appoint militia officers, except generals. The cost of war was to be paid out of the Confederacy Treasury. Outline the powers of Congress. The Committee of States, or 9 states, may act when Congress is in recess. Canada may join the Confederacy, and the Confederation will honor past debts, something most governments did not do. They left everybody high and dry. There had to be a unanimous consent of all states required for the amendment. It had to be unanimous, more than 2/3 or 3/4 vote. The articles lacked central power. While this looks attractive today, it virtually made operation impossible. Limitations of the Articles of Creation, or I should say the perceived limitations, there was no chief executive. Well, powers, and all states consent to the amendment of the Constitution. Well, this led to the Constitutional Convention, but there were certain factors to the point I'd like to discuss. Federation held the nation together through the war, like fairly. It was conflation. Such as Shays' Rebellion. The states were treating each other as foreign nations, enemies. Problems among the states. Borders with the English in Canada, Spanish in the West. During the war, Alexander Hamilton led urging for a central government. After the relationship that Washington had with Hamilton, he viewed Hamilton almost as a son, and his acts of valor during the war for called for a constitutional convention in Philadelphia. And this was
Are you people following along in the manual? I mean, to where you got. Where were we on page?
and others prepared the Virginia Resolve, which became the basic agenda for the convention itself. The convention was attended by 55 delegates from 12 states. Rhode Island did not send delegates. The delegates were intelligent, they were experienced, and they were educated. There were 31 lawyers, 19 military veterans, 28 former congressmen, 2 college presidents, 3 college professors, and 4 in foreign countries. Several doctors in science who attended as delegates. The delegates agreed on basic principles. First of all, the laws of nature and nature's God. They believed that God-given unalienable rights such as life and property existed. God was established by covenant, giving government only such limited power as the people delegate to it. All people rule have sinful nature. But
We all have a sinful nature. People need order, but rulers need limits.
Yeah, so we could kind of go down there. We're on D on page 69. The procedures were established in, how are we going to run this country? Had procedures. So they elected George Washington, who did not want to be president, but he was the acquiesced. There was 1 vote per state cast as majority of states' delegation desired. And to prevent false rumors, it was kept completely secret. That was a decision until the last of the delegates were to pass on. Isn't that something? I didn't know that. So that was James Madison in 1836. And to control the proceedings that someone didn't just take over, no delegate could speak more than twice on an issue until all the others had spoken. and only by permission.
I just have to add this because Madison, one of the last things that he said was Jefferson still lives. And then he passed away. He did not know that Jefferson died on the same day that he did.
Was it Madison? I thought it was Adams. He and Adams. Yeah, it was Adams. Oh, died the same day. Okay. So all remarks were addressed to the president. Most issues resolved by reaching consensus. Can you imagine that? 3 issues required compromise: representation in Congress. Large states wanted proportionate representation, but small states wanted equal. Therefore, Roger Sherman of Connecticut suggested a bicameral Congress with the House and Senate. So, if you didn't know the term bicameral, and but this was actually changed by the 17th Amendment that we will get into later. So that representation in Congress changed, and that's a very important one that changed, that gave more power to the federal government than it should have, took it away from the states. The counting of slaves for voting and taxes, and we'll get into the slave issue in a little bit today. The North wanted to count slaves for taxes, not voting. Isn't that funny? And the South wanted to count slaves for voting, not taxes. So, it's a little hypocrisy there. They called them the slaves' property. And so the North said, okay, then we're going to count our cattle and our tables and our chairs. So, and then there was a compromise for both purposes. And we're going to get into this in great detail. A slave counted as 3/5 of a person. And it's not the way it sounds, but that's a very important one that we'll be getting into in detail today. This compromise language had been mischaracterized by revisionist historians who claim it demonstrates the Constitution is a pro-slavery document declaring slaves less than fully human. And Frederick Douglass, he was born as a slave, and then he believed that was the case. That was the way he was trained. We'll get into this in great detail, so I'm kind of going to just skip that. It wasn't a pro-slavery document. It is not at all. And then the compromise that Congress came to is that the slave trade would end in 20 years. So that would be in 1828. And already a majority of the states at that point in time were anti-slavery, considering it an abomination. How funny. Oops. Funny. We're getting better at the tech issues, but not quite there yet. So on the closing days of the convention, this is kind of interesting stuff. July 26th, the Committee on Detail was appointed to work out the details. August 6th, well, I think you can all read those. But I love this last part. As the delegates signed the Constitution, Ben Franklin spoke. He referred to an etching of a sun on the back of George Washington's chair, and they actually would show the chair in the video. He said, I have often, in the course of the session and the vicissitudes of my hopes and fears as to its issue, looked at that chair behind the president without being able to tell whether it was a rising or a setting sun. But now at length, I have the happiness to know that it is a rising and not a setting sun. Yay. So were there any parts of that you're confused about or you wanted to mention?
So we have a lot of evidence that most of the founding fathers were Christian, and we have a lot of allusions to Scripture in the Constitution. But my question is why, and this is probably a question for the founding fathers, but since we're here, why didn't they specifically mention Jesus or Yahweh or, Jehovah specific, or even the Bible specifically in the Constitution? Because in my view, if you say God or the Creator, in legal documents, you have to be very specific. So if you just say God or the Creator, you're kind of leaving it open for a personal interpretation and a personal religious view.
It is a good question. And can I answer it? I don't know. But there are, when they signed the Constitution, if you see the signature page, it does, we can turn to that actually. If you have your Constitution, it's in the back of your, and we do get into that a little bit later in the course. But Mm, and I'm talking about before the amendments. Well, I'm sorry, I can't find it. Done in convention. It does say in the year of our Lord, 1787. So there, in some ways, they do acknowledge it, and we will get into this in a little more detail later in the course. Things aren't specifically coming to mind right now, Cheryl. And they were, I mean, like the Declaration of Independence, what does it say in the Declaration of Independence? What are let's just turn to it. Let's turn to that one. It's in the, We hold these truths to be self-evident. They didn't have to talk about it. That all men are created equal, endowed by their Creator. And one of the things, and then there, of course, at that point in time, too, all the constitutions were being developed by all the states, all of them specifically, and even to today, every state in the Union recognizes Christ or, a name or the Creator. They all recognize it in the first line of their Constitution. We'll be giving you a copy of that because I don't think most people know that. Every state in our Union, all 50, they have in their preamble, it's stated.
That's a really good question. And one of the things that I just keeps going over in my head is when all of those states, like Sue just mentioned, created their state constitutions, you were not considered, eligible to run for an office if you didn't already acknowledge that there was a creator God, that Jesus Christ, they just had their litany of things that they had, and they wouldn't allow people to be in office because they didn't believe that they could be trusted.
And the other thing is that there were various, there's Presbyterians, there were all kinds of denominations. I was trying to come up with that. Each state had different denominations. Some of them, they were completely maybe Lutheran or something else, but they each had their own. And so the federal government, I do recall this now, they did not want to get into that because they weren't there to control the states. And so that was part of the whole idea about, the religious freedom. It was not to say, we are a partially Muslim nation or a partially any of these others. It was a Christian nation. it wasn't to allow that, but it was to allow each of the states to establish that they could have said they were Catholic or they were some other, denomination, I guess yeah, but they all believed in God and Jesus Christ. So, does that help? I mean, those are good questions, and it's interesting to ask that because it's important to be able to state it to others.
Also, remember the paper that you got last week? Yeah, you got it during the week. I sent it with all of the quotes from the video that we watched the first couple of weeks. In there, there's a whole bunch of information and quotes by the individuals who said them from the time period. Okay?
And that's why we try to use original source materials, but we're here instructing. We're not the know-alls, but we have gone through this course a few times, so hopefully we get our memory refreshed.
It's my recollection that every one of the 13 states had their own state religion, and that they forbade the federal government from establishing a church. Congress shall pass no law about the establishment of a religion because they didn't want a United States of America church like the Church of England. And so I don't know how that became separation of church and state. It's a total bastardization of reality what they've done. It doesn't make any sense in this.
Yeah, we'll get into the Danbury Baptist letter and how this idea of the separation of church and state came up. But I appreciate that, and that's exactly, thank you for adding that. Do you guys all know where your homework assignments are and all that now at the end of your chapters? Yeah, so I'm not going to go through any of those kinds of things. And there are some things in there going deeper. You can go to the IOTC website if you really, cause some of these areas they'll cover in there, and they have great videos and things to watch. And you've been getting, hopefully you've been getting all the emails. Okay, good, okay. So if you can turn to page 76 of your student manuals, or it's going to be up on the screen. So the American Revolution was not really a revolution. Jake talked about this because A, most people in the colonies stayed loyal to the crown. B, the colonists saw themselves as reasserting ancient rights of Englishmen, not as revolutionaries. C, no fighting took place in England. Or D, fighting began before the Declaration of Independence was signed. I like that last one. So what's the answer? Anybody? B, yeah. So the colonists saw themselves as asserting ancient rights of Englishmen, not as revolutionaries. But there are people who would accuse the colonists of rebellion, an unbiblical act, which is in disobedience to God. And if you look in the 1828 dictionary, which we keep going back to because that was during the times, and people will use the fact to cast doubt on the Christian character of the founders. And we've already gone through that, as the gentleman back here mentioned. And most history books do refer to it as the Revolutionary War. Have you ever stated it that way? It's the Revolutionary War. The correct term would be the War for Independence, because that's what they were seeking, independence. They weren't revolting against God. So that's the thing, words matter. So we want to define our terms using this old dictionary, that was during the time of our founding. So, and the difference between revolutionary versus war for independence. So you have it here on the screen, revolt. I'm sorry, I felt like laughing. It was a movie I saw, and they said, "I'm revolting." And they go, "No, you're not that bad." So I'm sorry, it just popped in my head. And so words do matter, and I guess the context as well. So it's disobedience, a rejection of divine government, a departure from God. So that's not what they were doing, right? Does this sound like our founding fathers' plan was to depart from God? Okay. No, they even entitled their dissenting document the Declaration of Independence, not rebellion against the king. So that's the Declaration of Independence and the War for Independence. That's what it should be. If you want to get your language correct. The Declaration of Independence was a formal renouncement of subjection to the government, the British government. Were the colonists renouncing their subjection to government under God? Mm-mm. Then to who?
Sorry for running up here and interrupting. I just had to share this. Okay, I just have to share this because it's really pertinent to what we're just talking about. The Marine Corps was founded November 10th, 1775, a year before, well, 8 months before. In 1775, the legislature in England or in Britain had just voted that they were no longer going to be protecting the colonists. And therefore, the colonists no longer owed any loyalty to Britain either. And that is something that people do not know about.
That's interesting, isn't it? I didn't know that myself, but Cheryl was a Marine, so I guess required reading or something. So who were they, the colonists renouncing their subjection to? It's Great Britain, right? Okay. So if you want to turn to page 223, let's read out loud the first paragraph of the Declaration of Independence, which we did a minute ago, but I wanted to make sure everyone's there and we can read it together so we know exactly what our colonists were saying. And then you can, I like to get you to go there so you can make your lines and circle things and you go, wow. Some things you haven't noticed before maybe. Do you do that in your Bibles? I do it all the time. And sometimes I've read things a million times, it seems like, and then I come back to it one day and go, oh, I never saw that before. That's so exciting. So hopefully it does this when you read the Declaration of Independence. It's such a wonderful document. And it's still law. I just have to emphasize it's still law. So we can read this together. Let's just read this section. When in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them into separation. Think about what you just read. A decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes that propel them. So to whom are they writing? They were writing to King George, but they were writing also to mankind. They were also writing to you, the future Americans, their posterity. They wanted everyone to know why they did this. Irrespective of the outcome, they wanted people to know. I mean, aren't we kind of doing that now with the war that's going on in Iran and whatever? What propelled them? This was a very transparent thing they were doing. And it's kind of beautiful the way that we use the term all the time, transparency. They wanted their posterity to know we did it for a reason, and it's in effect today. And we need to understand, like you go through the 27 grievances they had against the king. And, you know, we talked about a few of them, which were, I think it was 15 and 19 or something, 13 and 19, they talked about pretended legislation. It violated all the laws of God and pretended offenses. And one of my favorites, I can't believe, and I go, it's so apropos today, is number 4. It was what the king was doing, and they say, for the sole purpose of fatiguing them into compliance. Isn't that where we are? It's like sometimes I got to turn off the TV, get away from everything, go out in the woods or something and go, I can't take hearing anymore, you know? And I went, fatiguing them into compliance. It's fatiguing the people into compliance with things that they know are wrong. It's just, I can't do it anymore. Fine, I'll just go along. And then we need God's help to not do that, right? To not give up. And that's the purpose of this course as well. And then of course, we've heard about no taxation without representation. That's kind of the only thing I remember from school, really, is why they did this. But there's 27 grievances. That's just one of them. And then there was a colonial slogan that sort of summed up all of it. No king but King Jesus. Isn't that something? So, and then we going back, a revolution versus a war for independence. So the revolutions, like in France, they were bloody, and lawless struggle, which is also what democracy creates. When it's just struggle for control, 51% controls everything, and you constantly. That's why our founders did not want a democracy in this nation. Mm-hmm. The war for independence was an entire nation by congressional decree freeing itself from the bonds of another nation to be free to govern themselves under God's laws. Remember the pilgrims, why they came here. So we have one of the questions in your student manual is at page 77, question number 8, if we can review that real quick. The fundamental purpose of the 3/5 clause. This is where we're going to get into this whole slavery and for counting slaves. And remember the video a little bit earlier, they called it, it came from the Slavs, how do you say that nation in Europe? The full name, Slovenia, is that it? The Slavs. That's where the term came from, slaves. Earlier, the short video up front. Anyway, sorry. Mm-hmm. Oh, maybe I just watched it too many times before we got started. I don't think we've done it. Okay, so sorry about that, folks. They played it over and over back there to make sure it would play, and I'm like, I just for sure thought you heard it. So the fundamental purpose of the 3/5 clause in Article 1, Section 2.3, and the point 3 means clause 3, because a lot of them aren't numbered. So you go 1, 2, 3, you count down clause 3 of the Constitution. The founders considered you're saying 3? C. To limit slaveholding states' representatives and bring an end to slavery sooner. That is correct. It's a star for you. How about let's look at the email we sent you. .2 was the number 4.2. So if you have that one ready, can we go ahead and play that video that I was just kind of giving it away? It's a little bit of a history of slavery. Here we go.
And now for a brief history of slavery. Here's the start in 1492 when Columbus discovered the New World. In fact, when the intrepid explorer landed in the Bahamas, the native Taino tribe hoped that he would help them defeat their aggressive neighbors, the Caribs. The Caribs enslaved the Taino and, on occasion, served them for dinner. Slavery existed in Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. The word slave actually comes from the Slavs of Eastern Europe. Millions of them, all white by the way, were captured and enslaved by Muslims in the 9th century and later by the Ottoman Turks. Slavery existed when the Roman Empire controlled the Mediterranean and most of Europe from the 1st through the 5th centuries. Slavery existed when Alexander the Great conquered Persia in the 4th century BC. It was so common that Aristotle simply considered it natural. The slave master model was just how the world operated in the Greek philosopher's day. Slavery existed during the time of the ancient Egyptians 5,000 years ago. As far back as we can go in human history, we find slavery. As renowned historian John Steele Gordon notes from time immemorial, slaves were a major item of commerce. As much as a third of the population of the ancient world was enslaved. Here's the second thing you need to know. White people were the first to formally put an end to slavery. In 1833, Britain was the first country in the history of the world to pass a Slavery Abolition Act. They were quickly followed by France, who in 1848 abolished slavery in her many colonies. Then, of course, came the 13th Amendment in the United States Constitution. After centuries of human slavery, white men led the world in putting an end to the abhorrent practice. That includes the 300,000 Union soldiers, overwhelmingly white, who died during the Civil War. Now, am I saying that this makes white people better than anyone else? Of course not. My purpose here is to simply tell the truth, and the truth is that human history is complicated. No one, regardless of skin color, stands guiltless. Yet today we are never told to consider the murderous Persian Empire or the cannibalism of indigenous tribes of North and South America or the heinous actions under the imperialistic Muslim, Chinese, Mongol, or Japanese empires, to name just a few. Instead, we're told that slavery is a white phenomenon. And like all persistent lies, this lie spawns a bunch of other lies. On social media, I come across extraordinary depictions about how Africans lived like pharaohs before Europeans came and laid waste to their paradise. I wish any of this were true, but it's not. Fantasy. The truth is that Africans were sold into slavery by other Black Africans, and in many cases, sold for items as trivial as gin and mirrors. Whites didn't go into the interior and round up the natives. They waited on the coast for their Black partners to bring them Black bodies. The stark reality is that our lives had very little value to our ancestors. Here's the third thing you need to know. If you think slavery is a relic of the past, you're wrong. There are some 700,000 slaves in Africa today, right now. That's the lowest estimate I could find. Other sources say there are many more. For context, that's almost twice as many slaves as were ever brought to the United States. Child soldiers, human trafficking, forced labor, these are the conditions that currently exist within the same sub-Saharan region where the transatlantic slave trade originated. African bodies are being sold today like they were sold then, and no, they are not being purchased by any country of white men. In fact, slavery, by any traditional definition, is exclusively practiced today within non-white countries. But we hear almost nothing about that. Just like we hear nothing about how slavery was universal until good people in Europe and America ended it 2 centuries ago. Why? Because our so-called leaders, Black and white, wouldn't profit from it. Black victimhood is nothing if not profitable. It elects politicians and funds racial grievance groups. And if Black Americans began to view themselves as partners in the American dream, if we embraced the patriotic spirit that holds all men are created equal, the patriotic spirit that is our real heritage, then the race hustlers University. Thank you for watching this video. To keep bringing you
Isn't that a good video and a good history? Pretty succinct. I also wanted to mention David Barton has a wonderful book and made a video called Setting the Record Straight, American History in Black and White. This has got some amazing facts about America that would follow what the PragerU video said, but it's so good. It's kind of lengthy, but it's really spellbinding. Things that I had never heard before. So let's look at the email, the one slavery. And if you've heard of Frederick Douglass, I know he's been mentioned in a lot of materials, but him on the Constitution, that first paragraph, the 3/5 clause is totally misunderstood, and it's been a stumbling block for a lot of people and blacks and college students. And in fact, I was invited to go with, it was several years ago with it used to be called anyway, it was a tea party out of the Colfax area, and they were able to go down to Sierra College in Rockland on Constitution Day. And so they invited me to participate in that as well. And I got to do the amendment. The Constitution was the 16th Amendment. When I showed up, they said, how about you do the 16th? And I had to remind myself, what is that one? And they had, which is exactly what's on the front of this. It was all these well-dressed, nice-looking black men. And they were all congresspersons. And it was so interesting to watch the students come out as they're walking by, and we had a big poster of this, and they would walk by and they were all really staring at that like, who are those people? So I was able to tell them they were in our Congress, the first Congresses in the United States. And it was just really a joy to go through that with them and to get them to look at some of the realities. It's not what they've been fed through. Yeah. So it's been a huge stumbling block. It's revisionists, and so they had experienced that. So it was really fun to the ones that stopped to talk to me, and it's basically saying, the 3/5 clause was all about declaring slaves to be less than fully human. It's not the truth, and we're going to go through that. So some of the words of Frederick Douglass were in the lecture today, and then, well, we kind of missed a little bit of that maybe with the garbled, but the Constitution reads, "We the people, not we the white people." This is Douglass. And if Negroes are people, they are included in the benefits for which the Constitution of America was ordained and established. And it includes some other quotes by Douglass. So reading the actual words of those who went through history at this time, at the time of our Constitution, is where you find the truth. And that's why we always use original source materials. Even Frederick Douglass had to learn that lesson because that's who was taught by him. And I know it's in here, the individual that taught him. Then finally he went to the Constitution himself, and when he read it carefully, he realized it was not what he had been taught. And I think that was just such an eye-opening thing for him. And in this American History in Black and White, David Barton says, during Douglass's first years of freedom, he studied at the feet of abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison. Heard that name before. Who taught him that the Constitution was a pro-slavery document. However, Douglass later began to research the subject for himself, things we have to do. He read the Constitution, he read the writings of those who wrote the Constitution, and I should have brought, it's called the Federalist Papers, and those are excellent. And if you can get that online, you can do word searches, and so you can go, it'll lead you. That's the wonderful thing about technology, right? You'll find what the founders said during when they were adopting the Constitution. So he began to research the subject for himself, read the Constitution, the writings of those who wrote it, and he found what he found revolutionized his thinking. He concluded that the Constitution was not a pro-slavery document. He explained, I was fully committed to the doctrine touching the pro-slavery character of the Constitution. I advocated it with pen and tongue, according to the best of my ability. Then he read it and said, upon a reconsideration of the whole subject, I became convinced the Constitution of the United States not only contained no guarantees in favor of slavery, on the contrary, it is in its letter and spirit an anti-slavery instrument demanding the abolition of slavery. He continues, now take the Constitution according to its plain reading, and I defy the presentation of a single pro-slavery clause in it. On the other hand, it will be found to contain principles and purposes entirely hostile to the existence of slavery. And if you read the Federalist Papers, which I did, I went back and read some of those that applied to this, and it was constantly they were saying it's abhorrent, and they were using terms like that. It was horrible. So our founders did not believe in slavery, though there were about 3 southern states that they were having difficulties, bringing the nation together. So mark the 3/5 clause in your Constitution. We already said where exactly it was, right? Help me out, Cheryl. And share it with other people anyway. So I want to turn to page 225 in your student manual. Article 1, Section 2, Clause 3. We're going to do what Douglas did. Sure.
Freedom Coalition on Friday, 6 through 8, this Friday, we're going to be showing Uncle Tom 2, which is exactly this. It's a potluck movie kind of night. Right behind.
Thank you. So the first 7 words tell you what the section's all about. Representatives and direct taxes shall be apportioned. So what's that saying? What's being addressed? Not really a trick question, just read it. It's addressing congressional representation and taxation. They're counting people, right? And for specific purposes, for how shall we tax and how many representatives based upon the number of people. So reading on. Hang on a second. So it first said, representatives and direct taxes shall be apportioned, and then it goes on, among the several states. Representatives and taxes shall be apportioned among the several states, which may be included in this union according to their respective numbers. That's the counting again, according to numbers. Does that make sense? Do you have any questions on that? So it's the number of people. It's page 226 in your manual, Article 1, Section 2, Clause 3. So it's for purposes of representation and taxation. It's apportioned among the several states. It used to be that the states paid taxes and then they sent them up to the federal government, not like now where we have the individual income tax. And that's a whole section we'll be studying later on. So for purposes of taxes, they had to know how many people were in the state. Okay? And how many representatives a state got in Congress also depended on the number of people in the state. So does that make sense now? Shall be apportioned among the several states which may be included in this union according to their respective numbers. So now we're going to,
The states would collect the taxes and send it to the government based on how many people were in each state, not, and so that was why it was so important to count the people too. But we're going to go on.
the whole census idea. So then we're going to get into the various categories of people that they were going to count. So it says, which shall be determined by adding to the whole number of free persons. So they're not talking about slaves, clearly, right? Adding to the whole number of free persons, including those bound to service for a term of years. And I don't know if you knew about indentured servants. A lot of people came to America. They couldn't afford the fare to get here, so they made deals with people that had money and said, when I get there, I'll work for you for a number of years to pay you back, or for other potential reasons, but they were called indentured servants. And then it goes on where you can see the up here, ... and excluding Indians. Okay, so now we're talking about Indians because they had their own nations, so they were not taxed and they didn't have representatives in Congress, right? That makes sense? Okay. So they weren't considered part of the United States. And 3/5 of all other persons. That's the slaves. So let's go through how many people we just talked about. Free persons. Today that would be most of us. Indentured servants that came from Europe, paid their way and said, we got to work. So they were included. Indians were not included. And slaves. Okay. So that's the 4. Is there any way then, looking at this, that you could, so did you understand, first of all, the sole reason was to determine the number of people that would have to pay taxes, that the state would have to pay taxes on behalf of. So the state would collect taxes based upon their population, and then they would also send representatives to Congress based on their population. And those that were included in that were the free persons, indentured servants, not in, and they talked about indentured servants, that was another category, not the Indians, and slaves. So the only ones that had 3/5 on them was the slaves, because the state then couldn't send as many representatives in. So they're not saying these are lesser persons because they're slaves. It's saying the state, it's what is the, it was a downright disability is what Douglas said on the states. In other words, geez, you're not going to have as many representatives and you're, and it also, unless you free the slaves. And then there was that argument that we talked about a little, earlier, why they were talking, the struggle between those states that didn't want to free the slaves and wanted to use them solely for numbers so they could have an extra representative or two.
Incentive to remove slavery so the southern states would then have more taxation revenue. So they created, it was an incentive rather than a degradation.
Yeah, so it was a disincentive, right? Yeah, another downright disincentive. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And then they finally, there was somewhat of a compromise, which was brought up earlier. It's in the Constitution, it specifically said in 20 years, all slavery will end in this nation. And that was a compromise because of the 3 southern states that were struggling with the whole idea. So in the words of Frederick Douglass, it's a downright disability laid upon slaveholding states, one which deprives those states of 2/5 of their natural basis of representation. And had the video played a little better earlier, it would have gotten that the difference there. So there's a video that we're going to close with because it's so relative to what we've been discussing and also what's coming up next week. And it's this whole thing to really help you understand the difference between a republic. We are a republic. We're a constitutional republic, which is the highest level of a republic. Yeah, and any government is for free government. And it'll contrast with democracy. But this will help lead into next week's. If you're ready up there. There we go.
When Benjamin Franklin exited the Constitutional Convention, he was asked by a woman, "Sir, what have you given us?" His immediate response was, "A republic, ma'am, if you can keep it." Yet most Americans today have been persuaded that our nation's governmental system is a democracy and not a republic. The difference between these two is essential in understanding Americanism and the American system. Before we discuss political systems, however, it's helpful to address the confusion that has been spread about the political spectrum. Many have been led to believe that the political spectrum places groups such as communists on the left, fascists or dictators on the far right, and political moderates or centrists in the middle. However, a more accurate political spectrum will show government having zero power on the far right to having 100% power on the far left. At the extreme right, there is no government. The extreme left features total government under such labels as communism, socialism, Nazism, fascism, princes, potentates, dictators, kings, any form of total government. Those who claim that Nazis and fascists are right-wing never define their terms. This amounts to spreading confusion. Toward the middle of the political spectrum can be found a type of government limited to its proper role of protecting the rights of the people. That's where the Constitution of the United States is. Those who advocate such a form of government are really constitutional moderates. So let's analyze the basic forms of government. They are monarchy or dictatorship ruled by one, oligarchy ruled by a few, democracy ruled by a majority, republic ruled by law, and anarchy, which is ruled by no one. In discussing these five, we'll see that they can be narrowed down to even fewer. Looking first at monarchy or dictatorship, this form of government doesn't really exist in the practice.
Okay. Mhm.
So I had written it down in my notes years ago, but I never look at those while I'm up here. And so I was sitting there looking at it. When Madison died, he said it's Adams that still lives. Adams died the same day as him. Jefferson, so that was where I got confused, had passed away 10 years earlier on the 4th of July, 1826. So sorry about that.
I thought they died just within hours of each other. Yeah. Yeah. I had the movie, the series, and it's really good. And I remembered that. And it's like, it's like one of them thought, I made it large. He made it longer than me, and it was the opposite within hours. So while they're setting that up, if they're trying to figure it out, I thought maybe we could go to your manuals. I think it's at page 86. The true and false questions. I don't know if any of you have answered those yet. And I just wanted to go over, looks like 4 of them. So if you haven't done them, we'll do it now. Yeah, it should be about page 86. I do believe. Is that right? Oh, it's in the students. Okay. 78. Okay, the true and false. Let's go down to number 4. During the War for Independence, Alexander Hamilton wrote letters to Washington urging a more decentralized government. Oh. Huh? That's not the answer. Is that true or false? It's the true and false questions for chapter 4. Lecture 4. During the War for Independence, Alexander Hamilton wrote letters to Washington urging a more decentralized government. Is that? So that should be marked false. And how do we make it true? Yes, he did. He wanted a more centralized government. So he wanted a stronger central government. How about number 5? And that would be, you can find that answer in your student manual at page 68. 5B, I think. So on number 5, the proceedings of the Constitutional Convention were published soon after they were concluded in order to rally support for ratification by the states. Is that true or false? Remember, what did they do when they actually did the opposite, didn't they? They kept it secret because they wanted people to vote on the Constitution for its substance, not to influence. And so that was what Cheryl was just talking about. Madison, he was the last one to die, and so yeah, she's ready to go on the video. Okay. And I'm going to go ahead, though, and do one last one. So that was at page 69 of your manual, if you want to put that there, and you can go back and read it. Number 10, all of the delegates to the Constitutional Convention eventually signed the document. Remember that? That was in Jake McCauley's. False. It's on page 70 of your manuals. It's all but 2. It was Eldridge Gary of Massachusetts and George Mason of Virginia that did not sign. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. So we're going to go ahead and play this really interesting video. It's with the forms of government, republic versus democracy.
When Benjamin Franklin exited the Constitutional Convention, he was asked by a woman, "Sir, what have you given us?" His immediate response was, "A republic, ma'am, if you can keep it." Yet most Americans today have been persuaded that our nation's governmental system is a democracy and not a republic. The difference between these two is essential in understanding Americanism and the American system. Before we discuss political systems, however, it's helpful to address the confusion that has been spread about the political spectrum. Many have been led to believe that the political spectrum places groups such as communists on the far left, fascists or dictators on the far right, and political moderates or centrists in the middle. However, a more accurate political spectrum will show government having 0 power on the far right to having 100% power on the far left. At the extreme right, there is no government. The extreme left features total government under such labels as communism, socialism, Nazism, fascism, princes, potentates, dictators, kings, any form of total government. Those who claim that Nazis and fascists are right-wing never define their terms. This amounts to spreading confusion. Toward the middle of the political spectrum can be found a type of government limited to its proper role of protecting the rights of the people. That's where the Constitution of the United States is. Those who advocate such a form of government are really constitutional moderates. So let's analyze the basic forms of government. They are monarchy or dictatorship ruled by one, oligarchy ruled by a few, democracy ruled by a majority, republic ruled by law, and anarchy, which is ruled by no one. In discussing these five, we'll see that they can be narrowed down to even fewer. Looking first at monarchy or dictatorship, this form of government doesn't really exist in the practical sense. It's always a group that puts one of its members up front. A king has his council of nobles or earls, and every dictator has his bureaucrats or commissars, the men behind the scenes. This isn't ruled by one, even though one person may be the visible leader. It's ruled by a group. So let's eliminate monarchy, dictatorship, because it never truly exists. Oligarchy, which is ruled by a group, is the most common form of government in all history. And it is the most common form of government today. Most of the nations of the world are ruled by a powerful few, and therefore oligarchy remains. At the other end, we find anarchy, which means without government. Some people have looked over history and found that many of its worst crimes were committed by governments. So they decided that having no government might be a good idea. But this is a mistake, because as the ancient Greeks stated, without law there can be no freedom. Our founding fathers agreed and held that some amount of government is a necessary force in any civilized, orderly society. In a state of anarchy, however, everyone has to guard life, liberty, and property, and the lives of family members. Everyone must be armed, and movement is severely restricted because one's property has to be protected at all times. Civilized people have always hired someone to do the guarding, a sheriff, a police force, or some branch of government. Once law enforcement was in place, the people were freer. They could leave their property, work in the fields, and so on. In short, the proper amount of government makes everyone freer. There are some who advocate anarchy, however, not because they want no government, but because they don't like what they have. They use anarchy as a tool for revolutionary change. The condition of anarchy is very much like a vacuum where something rushes in to fill it. These calculating anarchists work to break down the existing government with rioting, killing, looting, and terrorism. Tragically, the people living in such chaos often go to those best able to put an end to it and beg them to take over and restore order. And who is best able to put an end to the chaos? The very people who started it. The anarchists who created the problem then create a government run by them, an oligarchy, where they have total power. This is exactly what happened in Russia that led to Lenin taking total power, and in Germany, where Hitler's brown shirts created the chaos that brought him to power. But anarchy isn't a stable form of government. It's a quick transition from something that exists to something desired by the power-hungry. It's a temporary condition, and because it isn't permanent, we eliminate it as well. The word democracy comes from two Greek words, demos, meaning people, and kratian, meaning to rule. Democracy, therefore, means the rule of the people. Majority rule. This, of course, sounds good, but suppose the majority decides to take away one's home, or business, or children. Obviously, there has to be a limit. The flaw in democracy is that the majority isn't restrained. If more than half the people can be persuaded to want something in a democracy, they rule. What about republic? Well, that comes from the Latin. Res, meaning thing, and publica, meaning public. It means the public thing, the law. A true republic is one where the government is limited by law, leaving the people alone. America's founders had a clean slate to write on. They could have set up an oligarchy. In fact, there were some who wanted George Washington to be their king. But the founding fathers knew history, and they chose to give us the rule of law in a republic, not the rule of a majority in a democracy. Why? Let's demonstrate the difference in the setting of the Old West. Consider a lynch mob in a democracy. 35 horseback riders chase one lone gunman. They catch him. and they vote 35 to 1 to hang him. Democracy has triumphed, and there's one less gunman to contend with. Now consider the same scenario in a republic. The 35 horseback riders catch the gunman and vote 35 to 1 to hang him. But the sheriff arrives, and he says, "You can't kill him. He's got his right to a fair trial." So they take the gunman back to town. A jury of his peers is selected, and they hear the evidence and the defense, and they decide if he shall hang. Does the jury even decide by majority rule? No, it has to be unanimous, or he goes free. The rights of the government aren't subject to majority rule, but to the law. This is the essence of a republic. Many Americans would be surprised to learn that the word democracy does not appear in the Declaration of Independence or the U.S. Constitution, nor does it appear in any of the constitutions of the 50 states. The founders did everything they could to keep us from having a democracy. James Madison, rightly known as the father of the Constitution, wrote in essay number 10 of the Federalist Papers, "Democracies have ever been spectacles of turbulence and contention, have ever been found incompatible with personal security or the rights of property, and have in general been as short in their lives as they have been violent in their deaths." Alexander Hamilton agreed, and he stated, "We are a republican government. Real liberty is never found in despotism or in the extremes of democracy." Samuel Adams, a signer of the Declaration of Independence, stated, "Democracy never lasts long. It soon wastes, exhausts, and murders itself." The founders had good reason to look upon democracy with contempt because they knew that the democracies in the early Greek city-states produced some of the wildest excesses of government imaginable. In every case, they ended up with mob rule, then anarchy, and finally tyranny under an oligarchy. During that period in Greece, there was a man named Solon who urged creation of a fixed body of law not subject to majority whims. Where the Greeks never adopted Solon's wise counsel, the Romans did. Based on what they knew of Solon's laws, they created the 12 tables of the Roman law and, in effect, built a republic that limited government power and left the people alone. Since government was limited, the people were free to produce, with the understanding that they could keep the fruits of their labor. In time, Rome became wealthy and the envy of the world. In the midst of plenty, however, the Roman people forgot what freedom entailed. They forgot that the essence of freedom is the proper limitation of government. When government power grows, people's freedom recedes. Once the Romans dropped their guard, power-seeking politicians began to exceed the powers granted them in the Roman Constitution. Some learned that they could elect politicians who would use government power to take property from some and give it to others. Agriculture subsidies were introduced, followed by housing and welfare programs. Inevitably, taxes rose and controls over the private sector were imposed. Soon, a number of Rome's producers could no longer make ends meet, and they went on the dole. Productivity declined, shortages developed, and mobs began roaming the streets demanding bread and services from the government. Many were induced to trade freedom for security. Eventually, the whole system came crashing down. They went from a republic to a democracy and ended up with an oligarchy under a progression of the Caesars. Thus, democracy itself is not a stable form of government. Instead, it is the gradual transition from limited government to the unlimited rule of an oligarchy. Knowing this, we as Americans are ultimately left with only two choices. We can keep our republic, as Franklin put it, or we will inevitably end up with an oligarchy, a tyranny of the elite.
So you'll be having some homework and things to look at on that for next week.
John Green, this is Crash Course U.S. History, and today we're going to talk about...
There we go. So that's a lead into next week's lecture, and it's really crucial because how many people in government, people that work inside the government and our representatives, what do they call us? Very few of them call us a republic. They said, our democracy, oh, it's going to destroy our democracy. And I say, I hope so. Let's get rid of this silly democracy stuff. mob rule. And that's, some of the founders call it mobocracy, because it's the 51% rules. If they said anyone wearing, not green, I wouldn't say green, but anyone wearing blue, it's illegal and you're going to prison. I mean, you could do crazy stuff, which our founders were wise people. So anyway, I want to thank you, and God bless you on your way home. And if you have any questions, hang out for a minute, and unless you have something right now.
Oh, I just wanted to say, anyone that did not sign in, please do so before you leave. Okay? Thank you.